Welcome, everybody. It's yet another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is Nick and Peter from the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And as a reminder, this is season 3, Promises and Fulfillments. We're going through the Covenant Theology book, published by Crossway, edited and written by RTS staff. And we are on chapter 2. It's the Covenant of Works in the Old Testament by Dr. Richard Belcher.
Heck yeah, baby. Yeah, it's a good chapter.
Yeah, it's great. Dr. Belcher, I've listened to his lectures, free lectures on RTS website.
Oh yeah, shout those out. Yeah, shout out that website. People want to learn more.
Oh, this is what got me into this stuff before we started even doing the podcast. Is I started listening to free lectures on RTS. I know you've listened to them.
Yep.
But I've told Dr. Kluger about it and how edifying it is.
Yeah.
Oh, and shortly before we get to much more, I did forget about reminding you guys. You got to check out the show notes. You get a few links there that are really key. First, there's a link to getting your own copy of this book. So it's going to take you to Crossway's website.
Yep.
Order yourself a copy. Order yourself a copy so you can walk through this book with us. Number 2, there's a couple links to confessionally reformed churches to find near you. It's a church finder. You can find a church to call home. And a link to the Society of Reformed Podcasters. So you can find other great Reformed podcasters out there that were a part of the network too. So, okay. So I got the book in front of me. You got the book in front of you. What did you think of this chapter? What did you think of this chapter?
I thought it was a very fair assessment, and not just like, oh, let's overview this, but actually like the exegesis, which just means let's dig deeper into what the text actually says. And some misconceptions, and like I think probably the shortest treatment of the covenant of works in the Old Testament that makes like a lot of sense. Like it's thick and it's short, but it really well defines the covenant of works in the Old Testament. I loved it.
Mm-hmm. And I like that Dr. Belcher wrote it. He is phenomenal with being an Old Testament scholar. Yeah. So he was it backwards and forward. And
I like, because I think some chapters don't take this outlook or don't take this structure where he both presents like the case for covenant of works in the Old Testament, but also brings up some theologians we'll bring up later for those who might disagree with his viewpoints. So you kind of get both viewpoints.
That's correct. And because you brought that up, a sneak peek to the very last thing he says in that chapter, just to assuage everybody, he said, quote, "We should rejoice when people get the gospel right, even if they reject the covenant of works."
Even if we don't like them and we want them to go away.
They still, if they get the gospel right, that's good. But I think the gospel is better and best understood.
Totally.
In the light of the covenant of works.
But it's all about the gospel, but it's easier to get it when you have the covenant of works.
So the first thing I kind of wanted to bring up that you and I can talk about is the main chapters in the Bible he talks about referring this to is Genesis 1-3.
Yep. Yeah, so, Genesis 1-3, and there's a couple other ones like Leviticus 18, one in Deuteronomy, but that's the main one where they all kind of look back to it.
Mm-hmm. And he says, without the covenant of works, covenant theology crashes to the ground.
Yep.
Without it, it would be leaving one covenant to define the relationship between God and humanity, which is covenantalism. So
mono just means, one covenant.
Yeah. So we definitely need to understand the distinction between the covenant of works and the covenant of grace.
Yep.
So there is an aspect that Dr. Belcher talks about pre-fall versus post-fall Adam. And as we know in the Bible, pre-fall Adam is a pretty short stint in the Bible. It gets to post-fall.
At least like in a text that's short. We have no idea how long or short it was actually, but the text presents as like he was commissioned and he flunked.
Yeah, who knows how long a period that time
Yeah,
is.
he blinked and he failed. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
about what the text says.
Yeah. Um, so pre-fall, he makes it clear in here, pre and post-fall, Adam was still under the covenant of works.
Yeah. Covenant works pre-fall. There is no grace, and I liked how he really emphasized that. Where if you're monocovenantal, which just means you see one covenant, usually that one covenant is the covenant of grace.
Mm-hmm.
If you're what we call tricovenantalist, which we see covenant of redemption, which we talked about last week. This week we're talking about covenant of works, so we'll talk about the same thing next week in the New Testament. But within the covenant of works, Adam had no grace pre-fall.
That's
In
right.
fact, quote unquote, he had no help. It was him.
That's right. Yeah, there was no reason for grace to have entered the picture yet. However, there are some people he mentions in here, other theologians that have argued about that.
Totally, yeah.
That was grace pre-fall, but Belcher kind of argues against that as well, as saying no, that doesn't really make sense. And he explains why. So we're just trying to break down the chapter, whether you agree with us or not.
Yeah, and maybe to help define it too, for some of those who come in, it's like, oh, they're saying there's no grace in the Bible. All we're saying is grace means unmerited favor. It means given something that you don't deserve. And Adam in the garden had the ability to obey the law. If he didn't have the ability, that's where grace comes in. And that's technically a Roman Catholic thing, is when you believe in concupiscence and then unmerited and merited favor. There's these fancy terms, condign merits and congruent merits. It's big in the Roman Catholic Church. And so they say, no, Adam needed grace to obey the law pre-fall. As Reformed Christians, we say, no, Adam doesn't need it because he had the ability himself to obey the law. Mm-hmm. So we're not saying there's no grace. We're just saying he didn't need grace. Post-fall, he needs grace.
Yeah, and he had the ability to sin.
Yep.
And at some point in time, like before he sinned, he was fulfilling the covenant of works well, because he was in perfect standing with God.
Yeah. I mean, if we think about it too, he was, like you said, he was fulfilling it when God gave him they're all in Genesis 1-3 is a mandate. It's God telling Adam, these are the things I want you to do. God begins in Genesis 1 by naming the planets, by naming the plants, by naming the earth, by naming everything, by naming Adam. Then he tells him, name these things, which is a command. Adam names them. So he's fulfilling part of the mandates. And then he also adds on top, but don't eat of this. So it's kind of this list of mandates, and he fails at the end.
Yeah,
so he does have the ability to follow through.
That's true. Yeah. And dominion, I don't think Belcher specifically talks about this part, but it popped in my head just now. Dominion over naming the animals shows that you have authority over them. So a way my pastor actually described this is he was talking to me about in the creation account when God told Adam to name the animals, which means he had dominion over them. Which is the same way, like when we have children in our own homes, we're called to name them. So somebody else outside your family doesn't have the right to name your children. So you're seen as the authority figure. And so that does set up Adam to be our representative. He
and we'll get into this more later, but God he is the king of the universe. He's sovereign over the whole universe. He orders all things. Him commissioning Adam as part of the image was to be a king over Eden. So he was supposed to do things that God does as king. Adam was supposed to do as king. So as we're heads of families, Adam was head of creation. He was given that authority by God, but he was head of creation. So he's got this divine commandments, which is in this aspects with the garden, a covenant of works.
So getting farther into this chapter, I love how he goes right into the evidence for the covenant of works in Genesis 1-3. And then people are going to say, wait a minute, Genesis 1 through 3 never verbatimly
Yeah.
says the covenant of works. However,
Yeah.
hold up, he does say,
Yeah.
if you look at, hang on with me, Hosea
Hosea 6:7.
Hosea 6:7 references back to Genesis 1 through 3 and mentions the covenant given to Adam, which
Yeah.
is,
And
but
there's,
like,
there's both that, but I mean, even behind that, you don't even have to look at later verses to prove the earlier verse. It's, I mean, the analogy I always use, if you walk into a wedding and there's a bride and there's a groom, there's a minister up front, and they're exchanging vows, and there's all these rows of people watching this. If they don't say this is a marriage, if there's nothing labeled, if there's not a label on top of the arch that says this is a marriage, you can still safely assume everything here shows me it's a marriage, even though it doesn't label itself a marriage. Same thing with the covenant.
yeah. Yeah, and Hosea 6:7 states, but like Adam, they transgressed the covenant.
Yeah.
There they dealt faithlessly with me. So
Yep.
there references back there. And then actually, as I was reading this, I was thinking, and I'm surprised this hasn't really popped up. Maybe you've heard of it, of Covenant of Works mentioned this way, but the way I kind of, it popped in my head, how I best can understand it is the Covenant of Works really is equals obedience.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be with the Westminster Confession of Faith. I forget the reference, but it's perfect, personal, and perpetual. It's not just obedience sometimes. It is perfect obedience all the time and yourself.
Every second of the day.
Every second, all the time. That's the Bible's definition of obedience.
That's the
The Bible's definition of obedience is not like, oh, try to do it. The Bible's definition of obedience is perfection.
Yep. Which is the first commandment.
Yep.
And Jesus is the only one that has been able to ever do that and ever could do that. And if you've ever heard somebody say, I don't sin anymore, they're lying, because
yeah.
you would have to, like, every second of every day, love Jesus with all your heart, soul, mind, everything,
Yeah.
and to the fullest capability. And we just flat out can't.
Yeah.
Adam and Eve.
We might be able to increase in it, but the Bible does not explain you fulfilling the covenant of works by increasing in your obedience. It says you have to be perfect in your obedience.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Though we still increase in obedience, like, I want to make that clear. We still do and should increase in obedience. And we'll get into this later on. But in order to enter into heaven, in order to gain heaven, you have to do it perfectly.
Mm-hmm. So when we think of the word, we don't need to replace the word works with obedience, but just think of this for a second.
Yeah.
Pre-fall, Adam was in perfect obedience to God. Post-fall, he already was not obedient, and he couldn't do it anymore. And so that explains pre and post. And then the first time covenants, or the word covenant does occur in Scripture in this sense, would be
Genesis 6:18.
Yep, with Noah.
Yep. Yeah. And there's some debate on what the reference is, because the Hebrew word, sometimes people say it refers to a covenant that was already made, and he's just reestablishing it. So there's debate on this. Some people think that this is a covenant of works. Some people think this is a covenant of grace, but it's still, like you said, it's the first explicit reference to the covenant.
Mm-hmm. And I'm looking for this part where Dr. Belcher mentions a really good point about Noah. He says he is a second Adam, not the second Adam.
Yep. Yeah. So everybody post Adam, after the promise given in Genesis 3:15, where he shall crush, what is the Lord is cursing the serpent. He tells the serpent, he, talking about the seed of the woman, shall crush your head, you shall crush his heel. Ever since then, we're looking for, okay, who's this second one going to be? And so when you look at Moses or you look at Noah in this instance, you're wondering, is this the one? Because he's being set up like another Adam. He's being given this covenants and seeing, will you be faithful to my covenants? Genesis 9 and 10 shows us he won't.
Mhm. So we talked about Genesis 1 through 3. It's two parties to the covenant are clearly identified, which we described the definition of a covenant.
Yep.
And it's showing there's two different parties.
Yep.
And God is telling Adam to obey him in a certain way. Pre-fall, he's like, yeah, no problem. I have no reason not to.
Yep.
Post-fall, he just is lost. He doesn't know how to. It's not even natural to obey.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then he does talk about in here how because Adam is our representative and we have inherited this sinful nature from Adam. So we don't need to dig in too much about the new, obviously with Christ's role with the New Testament, because it's not specifically has to do with this chapter, but Dr. Belcher does match up how this points to Christ, how he fulfilled obedience for us through the law, and that's how we can find salvation. But I'm looking through here.
So after we got Hosea 6:7 questions related. So it's the name of it. So there's been a couple of names that have been associated with the covenant of works.
Yep.
So there's covenant of creation. There's covenant of nature. Turton, who's a famous Reformed theologian from the 17th century, he has his own statement that is pretty well regarded. Gerhardus Voss, so a name that's near and dear to a lot of Reformed people who I don't think many people know, but he's just a 19th and 20th century theologian. He talked about covenant of works, and so there's been different names, and it's not like one name is better than the other name, like it doesn't describe it better. But I think naturally, as like English speakers, one word can mean one thing to us versus another one. Like covenant of nature, I like how Belcher said, doesn't adequately describe this because covenant of nature assumes that what was made at this time, or covenant of creation, there's only one covenant, because there was not only one covenant.
Yeah, and if you misinterpret it or call it something else, he talks about how it flattens really the covenant of grace. It takes away the meaning of, like, we need to really underline the law and
the failure
that Christ fulfilled.
So I mean, at the end he says, like, there is good reason to call this the covenant of works, because it is a work covenant, not a creation covenant necessarily or nature one, but a covenant of works.
Mm-hmm. Something cool too he points out in here is, if people are wondering how Adam got his name, in Hebrew it's spelled the exact same way as human.
So it depends on context. So some context it's a personal name, some context it's human or humankind. So it can mean both things, just depending on where it lies and what's being referred to in the sentence.
Mm-hmm. He's our natural representative.
Yep. Yeah. He both represented us. So we were given his sin nature because he fell, but we also fell in him. So it's both. So it's not just we receive this, like, oh, it's like it's like somebody using your credit card without you knowing and then maxing out your credit card. You obviously had nothing to do with that. So we're not saying that Adam maxed out your credit card and then gave you back the credit card. It's like, oh man, sorry. Like I messed it up for you. It's we both maxed out our credit cards in Adam's sin.
He gave the possibility to max out our credit card. We maxed it out because
we maxed it out together, but he did it himself.
Yeah, he's a terrible person to go shopping with, I guess.
Don't go shopping with Adam.
No, but that's to the point of Jesus. He's not in Adam, he's of Adam.
Yep.
And the entire world, every person you've ever met is in Adam. Yep. We are all in Adam. We are completely this same nature as him. So the only way we can not be in Adam anymore, you have to be born again. And you born again through the Spirit. and become really inheritance of Jesus. And that's what Jesus is telling Nicodemus. So,
Yep.
so if you guys want to read a lot more about the covenant of works, like you were saying, Peter, Westminster Confession of Faith 7:1 does
Yeah,
go.
that's the big one.
That's the big one. Do you have that in front of you? Because I have it in front of me too. But knowing that you're in seminary school, you should have the honors of reading it.
Well, technically, the denomination I'm part of doesn't use the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Oh, I put you on the spot.
We use the three forms of unity, which predate the Westminster Confession of Faith. So we're cooler.
That's the URC.
Yeah, the URC. We use the Belcher Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Cans of Dort.
Ah, so I'm at an OPC. We use it.
So you can say I was Reformed before it was cool.
the Reformed hipster.
I was Reformed 100 years before the Westminster Confession of Faith came.
But you still agree with it. Right?
Oh yeah, I'm not saying I'm saying that to jest.
Yeah. So anyway, there's some other good points in here.
Yeah, so we can talk. I mean, we've kind of established the covenant of works. I mean, I don't think we've named it. So the covenant of works really refers to specifically when God tells Adam to not eat of a specific tree.
Right.
And so when the not eat of the specific tree doesn't mean by his act that this tree itself kills him. That's not what it means. It means this tree symbolizes the covenant between God and man. It's will Adam obey God's commandment. It has nothing to do with the tree itself. It is used as a symbol to point to obedience. Will Adam obey this? And we know it's a covenant because if he does eat of this, then death will occur.
Yeah.
And you can assume the opposite. If he doesn't eat of this, then his life will be extended.
Yeah. It was an act of disobedience, simple to the fact that we were not told why the tree is necessarily.
Yeah, there's nothing about the tree itself.
Yeah. The only thing that we get is it's supposedly it gives you the ability to call good and what you want to call it, and evil what you want to call it.
Yeah. So Adam, when he does that, and if you notice too, before this mandate is given to Adam, God uses the words good. So he calls something good in creation. Mm-hmm. He says, and this was good, and he called it good. And that culminates with man. And it says, and it was very good. And so God is already calling things good. So he's using his kind of sovereign kingship to say that this is good. And so when he's telling Adam, he's saying, as I have done in creation, calling things good, and assumedly calling things bad in some sense, not in the full sense. He's telling Adam, do the same as I've done. So he's copy my judgments. Mm-hmm. And when Adam eats of the tree, he's flipping God's judgment. He's saying, no, God, you're wrong. What you called as bad, I'm going to call good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we see Satan's first lie and our first sin so evident today, even.
Yeah, totally.
Like the world is, if you guys pay attention to the news at all, you can clearly see a lot of things that you're scratching your head is like, they're calling this bad thing really good, and they're calling these good things really bad. And you know, it's part of why the church gets persecuted in the world, is because the world just doesn't understand the church.
Yeah, but here, I have the 7.1 pulled up. So we'll read this and we'll get into the role of grace in the covenant works. But it says Westminster Confession of Faith 7. So chapter 7, section 1. That's what 7.1 means. The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience unto him as their creator, yet they could never have any fruition of him as their blessedness and reward, but by some voluntary condescension on God's part, which he hath been pleased to express by way of covenant. Saying God didn't have to come down and to create this covenant relationship, but he chose to come down That's not out of grace. It's just he chose to come down to establish a covenant with Adam. And this covenant showed Adam, you can do this. You can do what I'm telling you to do. You have the ability. And we see Adam doesn't do it.
And the covenant of works are really important because it lays the foundation for the gospel.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it was a probationary test to Adam to see if he would obey God and keep the terms of the covenant.
Yeah. And all probationary means is a short time period to see. It's like if you gave your kid 5 minutes to try to figure out a puzzle. That's what effectively God is doing with Adam. He's giving him a short time period and saying, okay, will you obey my commandments with this? And again, Adam fails.
Yeah, and we did talk about this in the covenant of redemption, how this was planned before creation. And
yeah.
I mean, I don't know the depths of God's mind, and I'm not going to try to. It's a lot of that's a mystery.
Oh, it's good because I do.
Well, and then we're going to spend eternity. We enjoy trying to.
Yeah, totally. No, yeah, we will never know the depths. We won't even know a drop.
But the only thing I can think of is this is played out because he's introduced the existence of grace, which pre-fall was foreign. Nobody knew even that depth of God. So I don't know. I'm just thinking of this in my head. Even the angels in heaven pre-fall didn't understand probably what grace looked like, maybe. And as soon as post-fall, when it entered the picture, they were like, holy cow, there's another new level of God's love.
Yeah, and there's some part, I think, in Hebrews that talks about this, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, but angels don't have grace. It's not a thing. They're under the covenant of works.
Yeah.
Because when you fall as an angel, you fall, and that's it. There's no redemption. And so there's some point where like they see grace, it's like, oh man, humans get grace.
Yeah.
Humans get to see the pleasure of God in saving them.
So they never saw that aspect of God pre-fall. So
yeah,
weird to think about. We get so caught up in what's going on in the history of the world, which is fine, but like it's cool that how this plays out. There's also heaven, like the angels watching this unfold too, and how they're looking at God and glorifying God and everything too through this story. So I think what it comes down to, human beings are held accountable to God and the subject to death on the basis of the terms of the original covenant, because it's the same covenant pre-fall with Adam as post-fall, but it's just now impossible to fulfill without having your mediator, Jesus, fulfilled it for you.
Yeah. So I think that brings us perfectly into kind of this last half section of the chapter. It says role of grace in the covenant of works. So bottom of page 69, and that flows right into the covenant of works and the gospel, because you have to get works right to understand the gospel clear. So I'm not saying you can't understand the gospel without works. So like we said at the beginning of the episode, you can still accept the gospel without having an understanding of the works. But to get the clearest understanding of the gospel, it really helps understanding works.
Right.
So if I can start, there's these three like little quotes that I pulled from right in the middle of page 70. It says the covenant of works and the gospel. So Adam was given this test, this short test to see if he obey God, keep the terms of the covenants. The obligation is implied in Genesis 3 and clearly taught in other passages of scripture. We can make three observations, and I'll just do the three. It says, first, the punishment of Genesis 3 are passed on to the descendants of Adam, which is why we need the gospel. Second, the continuing obligation to fulfill the covenant's requirements is affirmed in later scripture and the principle, do this and live, which is Leviticus 18:5, and it's actually talked about a bunch in the New Testament. Third, Christ fulfills the obligations of the covenant for the salvation of his people. So even right there, I think you get like three bullet points that really well summarize the gospel.
1-2 knockout punch.
Yeah, you got 1-2. Yeah, that's you could, like, if your friend asks you, okay, what's the gospel? You can say these three things. You can say punishment of Adam's sin was passed to you and me. Second, we are obligated to fulfill the same thing that Adam failed. Third, there's only one who did it.
Oh, can I give you a good one?
Go for it.
I got you a good one here too. He also says, Christ kept the law perfectly on behalf of those he represents, those united to him.
Oh, yeah.
His righteousness is imputed to his descendants through faith in his person and work. Christ kept the law and died on the cross as a sacrifice for sin, taking on himself the covenant curse that falls on all those who break the law. In this way, God can justify sinners through faith in Christ. The covenant of works is foundational to the work of Christ as the basis for our salvation.
Yeah. So if we not like we said, we can stress this. We're not saying if you don't understand the covenant of works, you can't accept the gospel, because you can accept the gospel without accepting the covenant of works. But Christ's work is really filled out when you understand just what we failed, how far we failed it, how deeply we failed it, and then how righteously and perfectly Christ kept it for you. And I like the quote that you pulled, because emphasizing his righteousness, which gives us obedience, which gives us entrance into heaven, which is the gospel, is imputed. So given to us, not like imputed means he gave something to us that wasn't ours to begin with, and it's foreign to us. To descendants through faith, not like our faith doesn't justify. I know that sounds weird, but I think a lot of people say like, oh, like I have a lot of faith. Like the faith is what like saves me. Your faith does nothing for you. What your faith does is attached to an object that does something for you. Your faith attached to Christ is what saves you. Your faith does nothing. Your faith just links you to the one who did it.
It's not the amount of your faith, it's the object of your faith.
Exactly.
So that's why he talks about like the mustard seed of faith.
Yep. That's exactly, yeah, this is almost exactly the point of that parable.
Because you could have a gigantic amount of faith in a false god.
Doesn't do jack for you, yeah.
Do anything, or you could be like, I actually believe in Christ in it and have a little bit of faith, and that's like completely different.
Yeah, totally. You struggle every day with your sin, which like we know. You struggle with like, am I saved? But that seed of the Holy Spirit convicting you and saying, no, like this is a sin. Let's work. Let's repent. Let's read. Let's pray. Let's get under the word. That seed is what saves you, not because your faith, but because what it's in.
And in the middle-ish, top middle of page 75, it really kind of focuses on the covenant of works in the standard Reformed theology view. And it's really important to understand there is a distinction between the relationship of God with Adam and Eve before the fall and after the fall. It's radically different. What it really breaks down to is the relationship is severed and broken. And so I think we've kind of repeated that over and over on this episode. It's impossible for Adam and Eve to have fellowship with God unless God covers their shame and takes care of their guilt. So it's nothing we can do. We can't cover our own guilt.
You know, one thing we can do? We can keep adding to our guilt. That's it. We can just keep adding to our terribleness.
The only thing we're good at is being bad.
Exactly. Which is not a good thing to be good at.
No.
But yeah, the stuff you're talking about, it's like right in the middle of various views concerning the relationship between God and Adam in Genesis 1-3. And you were reading right in the middle of when he's talking about W.J. Dumbrell. So he talks about a couple theologians. He's not like, I like the approach that he took, because he's not like disparaging them and saying these are terrible human beings. No, don't listen to them. But they're still brothers in Christ. But he brings out like, hey, there's this nuance in the understanding of the covenants that may not be the best nuance to have when we understand the gospel at its fullest. But he's not saying these are not Christians.
I wonder what Belcher would say if I was like, what about if I called it the covenant of obedience? He'd probably still You might give me a little pat on the back.
He's like, good job.
We're still sticking with the covenant of works.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Well,
yeah. But I mean, maybe we can cover. So Palmer Roberts in his book, The Christ of the Covenants. There's a couple quotes that he has. So he denies, and again, he's not trying to disparage these people. So I'll start off by saying that he's not trying to like whack them up top of the head and say, you idiot. But he's kind of giving us like a structure to think about. So he's saying Robertson denies that there's a covenant relationship. This is bottom of 71 between the members of the Trinity, usually called the covenant of redemption. So he doesn't like some of these fancier words that aren't explicit in the text. And that's where Belcher says, we're not talking about explicitness in the text. We're saying contextually, what are the things the text brings us to? Because if we forget the covenant of redemption, it's hard to see how the Trinity plays a role in our salvation. And so we talked about that. And then John Murray, I think I've read a lot of John Murray, my own. He's a great systematic theologian, but he did have an understanding of what's called, what you said, monocovenantalism. So he was effectively only a covenant of grace. And you guys can hear this right here. So I'm looking through, and kind of right in the middle of what he's saying, he's talking about the covenant of works. He calls it kind of the Adamic administration. So he says he defines, this is towards the bottom of 72, he defines a covenant as a sovereign administration of grace and promise. And under this definition includes the Noahic, Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic, and New covenants, but he does not consider the pre-fall relationship between God and Adam. So he's not calling him a non-Christian or saying like he's an idiot. He's just saying if we lose the covenant of works, it's hard to see specifically what we're saved from and how we're justified.
That's true. Yeah, the radical impact of how impossible it is for us to fulfill works in the law, and how like I've said this in the very, very beginning of our podcast show, it's like us being a fish told to climb a tree. Like it's just not going to happen.
It's not a thing. Yeah.
And it's just not a thing, right? And then, but Jesus could do all this. He is the law fulfilled. He came and in perfect obedience.
Yeah. And then unfortunately what we see, and I know there's a lot of debate about this, but just kind of have it before your guys' eyes, I know some of this stuff is brand new to some of you guys, is Murray is part of this monocovenantal crew. And this led to what's called, and he didn't intend this. I think some people assume that Murray intended this, but did not, because he lived before this happened. But a lot of his ideas were actually taken by the Federal Vision crew. And Federal Vision has been kind of under heat over the last 15 years. And I think rightly so. And I won't say much more about the Federal Vision personally, but there's some weird stuff that they take because they don't see works. And if you don't see works, your doctrine of justification, how you're saved, how you're ruled obedient under the law in the courtroom of God, really suffers.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Because even so, this is bottom of page 76, top of page 77. This is with under the Federal Vision kind of heading. And he says right here, describing the Federal Vision movement, says, thus the garden was a kindergarten, a place where Adam could grow from childhood to kingly maturity, a place of easy life with free food, a place to learn how to cultivate and guard. And then right after this, 2 paragraphs later, he says, this focus affects Federal Vision proponents' understanding of the work of Christ, who does not fulfill the law on our behalf, but becomes the first perfect, mature man through faith, which makes him eligible for transformation into glory. So he almost becomes this figure that we look to, not the figure who saves us. Doesn't say that. And then at the very end, it says reworking of the covenant of works changes how one understands the work of Christ and the basis of justification by faith.
Yeah, in that same section, he talks about how that viewpoint has a hard time understanding where the faith is in all this
Yeah,
pre-fall, but they might be mixing waters and not correctly making a distinction between works and grace.
totally. Yeah, and I think if we would push into this a little bit more with their distinction in a lot of this movement, the federal vision movements, and we've talked about this before with other guests on the podcast. We talked about this very specifically, Dr. Horton, in season 2, towards the beginning. We asked, can you lose your justification? Because federal vision says you can. They say because justification is not earned, it can be lost. It's more maturity. They see justification, just like that quote says, as maturity in the faith, not a one-time pronouncement says this sinner is saved.
Yeah.
Which we deny wholeheartedly what they're saying. We say, no, justification is a one-time pronouncement by the judge saying Jesus's obedience and righteousness has been given to you. That has fulfilled the law on your behalf. You are now justified. We say that.
I think they're looking at the progression of sanctification without the assurance of justification.
I think so. Yeah, I think what you said before is they're taking justification and sanctification, smashing it together and saying that's justification.
Right. Well, pray for our brothers and sisters in that kind of viewpoint.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot of true Christians in that. So just give them grace, pray for them that, we're just kind of working through this stuff together. So
yeah. And I like towards the end. So page 78, last paragraph. Actually before this, and I'll do this last paragraph. So it says this kind of first paragraph to 78 towards the end. It says sometimes these views, he's talking about the views we just talked about, also result in a weakening of the use of the law with the denial of the contrast between the law and the gospel. Then he moves further on and says the contrast between righteousness of the law and righteousness of faith, a contrast between law and gospel, is foundational for a proper view of the work of Christ. And he references Romans 10, 5-6, and our justification. So if we lose this distinction between covenant of works, our responsibility on the law, and covenant of grace, the fact that Christ has done that for us, it's really hard to have a fuller understanding of what the gospel is.
Mm-hmm. And then right immediately after that, he says the covenant of works gives the work of Christ a rationale for why he had to come and what he had to accomplish for our salvation, which is cited in Romans 5:12-21.
Yeah. So if we're not sure what we're saved from, what do we think Christ did for us?
Yeah.
It's really hard to understand that.
So let me ask a kind of a rhetorical question here.
Okay.
Peter, is it good that there is a covenant of works?
Heck freaking yeah, it is.
Yeah, because it gives that distinction and it gives the heavy humility and impact of what Christ did in the covenant of grace.
Yeah.
Now, another question. What's the difference between the covenant of works and the law?
They're effectively the same thing.
Okay.
Where covenant of works given in the garden, we're actually given a fuller exposition of it in Exodus 20. People know that as the Ten Commandments.
And I'm glad you brought that up because he does in this chapter briefly mention how the law really, hopefully I'm getting this right off my memorization, isn't really introduced until Moses, right? The law.
Yeah, so the law is more fully introduced with Moses and the Ten Commandments. It takes what we see in the garden and expands it, but doesn't change it or doesn't really anything new. It just expands it. It says, this is effectively what was in the garden. It's just expanded more in view. Like Israel's failed this, yet don't just look at the law. Look what the law is pointing to.
Yeah. And I think he brought that up because he was explaining sin existed before the law.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Sin existed before the law, which means the law indicts us more specifically. We see our law, and Romans 7, which you guys will hear about from Dr. Waters next week. Romans 7 is us looking at the law and saying, I can't do this. This is pointing out some things in me that I know exist. I don't want them to happen, but they're there. And don't just stick there. It's pointing you to the gospel, pointing you to the one who's done it for you, which I think a lot of Reformed people can just stick at the law and say, like, oh man, you guys suck under the law. Good luck. But you have to see the law is not just the law. The law exists to point out your sin at the same time that it points you to Christ.
So the law is God's standards,
Mhm.
and works is our level of obedience.
Yeah, it's how do we fare under the instructions given to us?
Yeah. Oh man, thank goodness for the covenant of grace, the gospel, Jesus.
Yeah. So I mean, just to wrap it up, just to give you guys more like a not fuller but more concise. It's covenant of works establishes both what we can't do, what Adam didn't do, but what Christ has done. So it's, if you haven't taken hold of Christ, you are under this covenant. You can't do anything about this covenant. So it's, as we'll pronounce more specifically next week, but it's also Christ is the only one, literally the only one who's fulfilled this. And it's us taking Christ's obedience, not our faith. Our faith grasps. Our faith is the instrument used, but Christ is the actual one who's fulfilled it for us.
That makes sense to order this book based on the titles of the chapters, because it's the covenant of redemption, which was like before all creation. Who knows? It could have been before all the angels, because it is really just talking about the Trinity. And the covenant of works in the Old Testament, we don't really have biblical references to what angels were thinking before, at this time. But the covenant of works pre-fall, Adam, was the same covenant of works also that angels are under, and the covenant of works are still what angels are under right now.
Yeah, I mean, humankind is also under. If you're not under Christ,
right,
you're under the covenant of works,
and you're under the covenant of works.
But the covenant of works, like Dr. Waters, just to give you guys a preview, will stress: don't stop at the covenant of works. It exists to point you forward.
Don't stop. Keep going. Keep going.
Covenant of grace is there. So we'll cover that later on, but hopefully you guys, after this episode, have a fuller, more gospel-centered understanding of the covenant of works, and read chapter 2 of this book. It's thick, short, to the point. Gives you what you need to know and no fluff.
And actually, please read Genesis chapters 1 through 3.
Yeah.
And
Galatians 3, Romans 10. Because Galatians 3 brings up Leviticus 18:5, Deuteronomy 22. There's 2 other references. But Paul looks back at the covenants and says, like, yeah, it says do it perfectly. You guys say you're doing it perfectly. You're not doing it perfectly. Look to the one who did it perfectly.
Yeah. And Paul, as you'll learn next week with Dr. Waters, he's not coming up with anything new. He's repeating what is in the Old Testament scriptures. And Paul knows the Old Testament really stinking well. If you have any understanding of who Paul is, he has the highest level of education.
Yeah, there's no doubt he has. I mean, we know the schooling that they got in the first century, especially Paul under Gamaliel. Gamaliel is the Harvard of first century Roman citizens. And Paul had the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the law, likely memorized down flat in both Hebrew and Greek, both of those. Probably had a majority of the historical books. So think like the Kings, Samuel, Judges, Joshua, had a majority of that memorized down flat.
Yeah.
Likely had all the Psalms memorized down flat. So he's no slouch. He knows his Bible.
He's just pointing to the Old Testament and illuminating it rather than making up all sorts of brand new stuff, which is another conversation for another time, because there's a lot of unfortunate criticism against Paul in some churches.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, he's also not just looking, he's taking what's already there and explaining it to New Testament Christians. It's not new. He's like, this is what the Old Testament says about itself.
Yep.
I'm just bringing it to you.
Yep.
So yeah, look forward to next week. Next week's great. But
so yeah, next week is the Covenant of Works in the New Testament. So
yeah, and if you guys listen to this, it's like we already said, it's with Dr. Waters, so the guy who wrote the chapter. So you guys will get to enjoy an episode with the author himself. We've had him on before. So if you guys want to listen to our episode with Covenant Theology with Dr. Waters, I think it's number 6 of season 2. So listen to that one if you guys kind of want an overview, and then listen to next week too.
Just in case you guys are like, oh no, all season 3 is just Nick and Peter talking.
Yeah. They're like, guys, there's a reason why we liked season 2 a lot more, because it wasn't you.
No, yeah, right. There's a little mix. Like there's 20, like there's quite a 26, 28, whatever chapters in this. So we're gonna mix it up.
About half will be us, half will be with guests.
Yep. We're gonna have fun with it. We're gonna have a little help from some friends, as that song goes. Every now and then.
Yes.
I didn't sing the song.
Please do.
I might find the track, and like when we bring somebody on, maybe
oh boy,
play a little clip of
that's
it.
like the recipe for having them just like, okay, bye on Zoom, and then leaving.
I don't know how to even do those technological things.
That's probably a good thing.
Need to hire an intern to just do that stuff for us.
That's true. If you guys know anybody, here's a specific shout out. If you guys know anybody who wants to be part of a podcast, who we can give you guys some juicy details of what we'll give you. But if you guys know any interns or people who like social media, who like building websites, who know how to use YouTube, we have a pretty sweet deal for somebody if you want to be part of a podcast that's growing pretty fast. So let us know. Shout us out. If you have a friend who's in college or who wants to learn and be part of a cool kind of ground level podcast who's growing pretty fast, and shout us out. We'll hook you up and we'll talk some shop. It
may or may not be what a Reformed.
Oh my gosh, I would salivate if a Reformed person
would spend their money on anyway, which
yeah,
could probably assume that's a book.
Yeah, we might have a lot of free of those things for somebody who wants to intern for us. So let us know. We'll probably tweet this out pretty soon or put it on Instagram. We're looking for interns to help us out. If you're a Reformed intern and you like books, you're gonna like us a lot.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, but hopefully you guys enjoyed this. You guys saw the works, you guys saw the law, you guys saw the gospel, kind of all at the same time. But yeah.
One thing I would add is I wish we personally knew Dr. Belcher, but what I would say, if you want to hear his voice, and walk around with your earphones on and hear him while you're walking the dog or whatever, and take a break from our podcast, go to RTS, which is Reformed Theological Seminary's free lectures. It's I don't know really how to walk you guys through.
I'll link it to the show notes.
Yeah, you guys can find it. And Belcher does a lot of those lectures that I've listened to. You can find Kruger, who we've had on the show before, and some others. But Belcher, if you want to hear his voice and how phenomenal he is on unpacking the Old Testament, you can hear his voice on there.
Yep. So we'll see you guys next week for Covenant of Works in the New Testament with Dr. Guy Waters.
Mm-hmm.
Peace out.